this is a good segue into the limited liability business structure. I think we should start with those companies that are formed basically every day. I think so far, in an incorporation recently, it is 18,000 and something. We're at 18,000 companies. Of course, nobody talks about the other side of that, which is that recently 1,400 companies were struck off the register for non-compliance. What would you say to those people considering starting a private limited liability company?
I think it's important that they understand the concept of limited liability, first of all, and also the obligations, because a limited liability company is a fiction created by the law, that it has a completely separate legal personality to the individual, that this separate entity has various obligations. So one of the first things that I think, or I should say one of the more common matters that people don't quite grasp when you incorporate is that you have to file audited reports every single year. You have to have an organizational meeting within the first 18 months of incorporation. And perhaps most important is you have to keep records of the company.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't keep the share register, if you don't keep a register of the decisions made by the board to open an account at the bank, because all of these documents are open to public inspection if someone comes and turns up at your door. But I think what a lot of people also miss is the fact that every year you have to pay an auditor to file audited reports. You can't get around that. And I'm sure, Brenden, you've had several people say, oh, well, we didn't do business in the first year. Why are we filing audited reports? Well, that's what the law says. And even if that audited report says simply, there has been no business there have been no business transaction and no business conducted by the company, they still have to pay the auditor to say that. And they may say, well, that's a sentence. Yeah, it is a sentence, but it has implications. And so I think, first of all, the concept of what a limited liability does, it protects and insulates the company and insulates you, the individual who has established the company, from adverse consequences over and beyond the assets of the company. And that's quite often one of the primary reasons that you set it up. When you go into a company with a partner. So two guys who are very good and they're very complementary. They have a mechanic shop. One person is good at body work and the other person is good at the mechanics. They decide they're going to open a business called Full Body Works Inc. But nobody discusses at the start how they're going to manage disputes between themselves. How they're going to manage who brings what. So the bodywork says, well, you may be good at mechanics, but at the end of the day, if the car doesn't look good, we're not going to get customers. So I should get more. All these issues need to be dealt with before you form that company. And I find it's a little bit like marriage. When you're going up the aisle, everything is dandy and nobody thinks that a day will ever come where there are potential difficulties. And when that day comes, you then discover that each party had a completely different appreciation concept of the business they were going into and what role or how the profits and expenses would be shared. One of the first things quite often when this tends to happen more with Guyanese persons rather than international persons, you say to them, work out the mechanics of how you're going to handle disputes, how you plan to share the expenses, what is going to be the distribution of the profits, and that you can only take profits out if you declare a dividend. So all those details, you get into an arrangement, you set up the company, it does well, and then when it starts to fall apart, you discover, well, I didn't quite see that way, or worse, what happens is one of the parties dies. There's no shareholders agreement, and the family comes along and says, hey, my dad, that wasn't what was supposed to be going on. And of course, nobody keeps records when they get into the business, and they have problems.
Well, that's one of the better circumstances because I want to raise the fact that usually our companies are usually one-man companies here. One man sets it up, runs it for the entirety of his life. They don't usually think about what happens with shares. Sometimes you got bad shares being issued. Otherwise, no one can benefit from the assets of that company. Nobody can take over the company if there is no board, no secretary in place. But do you think that this is a failing of our business culture because it's not what people see. Continuity planning, and it's kind of like, again, it seems to be the cult of personalities, which is that there must be one strong man in charge of everything at all times. And you know, I think that's one of the reasons why the people who are getting into business together, starting a company together, don't address these issues because they might end up breaking up the relationship before it can even be fully formed.
You actually absolutely, you have touched on, and I'm happy you raised that. It's the cult of the personality, the one man personality. If you think of so many businesses in Ghana that were built around a personality that just don't exist today. Even in our profession, if you go back, Clark and Martin, it ruled the roost for what, I don't know, 3 decades, 4 decades, had most of the government work for whatever reason. Doesn't exist. And succession planning, which is really, I think, exceedingly important. I'm happy you raised that. It is so critical. Because what's the point of building a multi-billion-dollar empire and then at the point of succession, when the key player departs, it falls apart? That perhaps is one of the greatest challenges we face. I mean, we've had some great examples in the Caribbean where the exact opposite has happened, but I think that one-man culture thing probably has come from our colonial past, where, you had very strong personalities, people didn't push back against them, and then the entire organization sort of evolves around them. And then, of course, when that key figure is removed, chaos happens.
Well, I gotta say the one exception, since you've mentioned our profession, Cameron and Shepherd, which has just celebrated his 125th anniversary. Successive people, starting Cameron and Shepherd, have been able to take a business, now not even an incorporated company, but a business, a partnership, through 125 years, which is unprecedented, especially among lawyers and different lawyers. It's not only been a family operation. Right?
Yeah.
So I think that is a really impressive achievement.
Indeed. I mean, to get to 125 years in anything is impressive. And in that case, that entity, like you say, it didn't start as a family business. It didn't continue. It is what it is. And that is rare. What happens mostly, particularly in our profession, is that, the sons and daughters in the next generation tend to carry it on. But the structure is not necessarily one that endures. But yeah, I applaud them for having made it to 125 years.
So let's touch briefly not-for-profit companies. They have their uses, not necessarily for business, but I don't think enough people understand not-for-profit companies here. Is there any experiences that you've had with setting up NPFs or NPFs coming to you for advice that you wish to share?
First of all, I would beg, Brenden, that you perhaps consider what a not-for-profit is, because I think people don't quite know what it is, and it's not really defined in the Companies Act. Quite often, people don't understand what a not-for-profit is. So it doesn't mean that a company can't make a profit. It just means that it can't distribute the profit to the shareholders.
Yeah.
And part of that problem stems from the fact that when we set up what is now the Companies Act, this is back in 1991, and it came into effect in 95. Under the old Companies Act, when I started to practice, you had a separate category of company called charities. And there was a whole host of specific provisions in the Companies Act that dealt specifically with charitable organizations, how they ran, what were their obligations. What quite often happens now is people rush to set up a not-for-profit because they're probably trying to get registered as an NGO or whatever is driving that, but without fully understanding what it means. It doesn't mean that the entity can't make quote-unquote a profit in terms of balance sheet. It just means that can't get distributed. As happens often in Ghana, we tend to contort and distort what we're trying to do into what is available. So not-for-profit essentially is a limited liability company in which it says that all the profits it makes will be reinvested for the purposes for which it's set up. So if you set up a not-for-profit for the purposes of feeding children in All Boys Stone, you raise a lot of money, or you're selling planted chips again and you make a lot of money out of it. The people who work there or the people who set it up can't take those profits and say, this belongs to me. It has to be reinvested. It doesn't mean, and the American model is the Americans have different models, especially if it's a Delaware type establishment. But it doesn't mean that the people who actually run the company can't get paid at commercial or above market rates. So quite often, if you have, the C-suite, chief financial, chief operating officer, chief executive, they can actually make substantial sums of money in that capacity because they get paid to run the not-for-profit entity. A lot of people here, I think, set it up because they want to do an NGO, and then they see the balance sheet at the end of the year and they see there's a huge amount of money available, but it's not available to be distributed amongst the people who set it up or who are the big movers and shakers.
What you've raised there about the current Companies Act not having specific provisions, do you think that is something we should see? Now, I should preface this by saying that for years, we've been hearing about new legislation governing companies. That has not come to happen just yet. I mean, even in the budget speech of the Attorney General in 2026, one of the acts that he has listed, or one of the pieces of legislation that he says is going to come into being in 2026, is a new Companies Act. Do you think that we should have specific provisions in this for not-for-profit companies? Now, I see. So one of the things that you will see when you set up not-for-profit companies here is that if you want to set up that type of company, it cannot have share capital. What has your experience been with the tax, or if you have any experience with the tax side of it? Because like in the US, you'll have IRS 501c companies, right, which have specific tax exemptions. Even in the UK, charities and social organizations, you'll have tax exemptions or tax breaks. What do you think that should look like in Guyana for recognized not-for-profits?
So, Brenden, you just touched on another very, very important point. People who set up not-for-profit organizations assume that because it's set up and it's a not-for-profit, automatically the company does not have to pay corporate tax. The present regime in Guyana is you got to apply to the Minister of Finance to get exemptions. The fact that you're incorporated doesn't exempt you from corporate tax. So that's the first issue. In relation to New Companies Act, the fastest evolving industry is corporate affairs. I mean, our act is 1991, came into effect in 1995. That's several decades ago. And when we set it up, we didn't have not-for-profit specifically identified. I think not only do we need a New Companies Act, we need specific legislation for non-governmental organizations, because quite often people want to set up an NGO. It's a little amorphous term, and they're not quite sure what it is. So you have to deal with what exists in the marketplace. And clearly there is a significant demand for quote-unquote NGO, non-governmental organizations. But more importantly, under the Companies Act, you need several new features. One of them is, as we're dealing with this topic, is what are not-for-profits, and what is the regime that operates for not-for-profit, and what are the penalties if you essentially operate a commercial entity and you have registered a not-for-profit company. So the lawyers, the accountants, the auditors, everybody knows very clearly from the legislation exactly what their obligations are, what their filing requirements are. And so certainly after several decades, we definitely knew, not just for this, for many other reasons, stated capital and all the other modern requirements that we don't quite meet.
Well, since we have gotten into operational requirements now, let us take a look at operations of a business. When you start up, obviously the operations are a bit different. When you're 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 years down the line, there are a lot of different challenges that business owners don't necessarily think of. And I think it would be beneficial for us to discuss that, so at least they could get some insight on it.